What is up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and the Practical SQL Server HA show is designed to share with you tips, tricks, hacks from my own personal experience working as a consultant specializing in high availability and disaster recovery solutions, as well as those of my customers. And this is the Back to Basics series, where I focus on SMH. Why don't I put my slide up on the screen? If you haven't seen part one of this, be sure to go and check the recordings. This is a multi-part series on going back to the basics and focusing on the non-technical aspects of SQL, high availability and disaster recovery. And in the last episode, I talked about S, or that other storage. And like I said, I'm going to be switching back and forth between slide deck and the camera. It's one of those rare moments where I actually use a slide deck because it's again, going back to the basics, emphasizing things that we technical professionals sometimes do not pay attention to when it comes to implementing, designing, and even managing a high availability and disaster recovery solution. Maybe because we're so fixated in the technical stuff. Anyway, let's get down to business. Again, grab your pen and paper. Take notes. Yes, by now you probably are aware of the fact that I still love my pen and paper because my pen and paper does not run out of battery. And of course, the memory does not get corrupted. Anyway, in the last episode, I talked about S, or the other storage, where I talked about stuff like runbook or documentation, backups, where are they located, installation media, drivers, firmware, and you. You have institutional knowledge that you need to share with your team. So those are the other storage media, not media, but those are other storage. Yeah, I use the word storage. Now, your brain is a storage. It is. Of collected information and insights and knowledge and wisdom, right? The other storage, M, getting back to part two of this, M stands for that other manpower, right? That other manpower. It is very tempting to just focus on you, whether you're a sysadmin or DBA, taking care of your high availability and disaster recovery solution. But what I tell my customers all the time is that high availability and disaster recovery is a team sport. You need other people on the team in order to make your high availability and disaster recovery solution work. And it's even in the implementation phase, because you're going to rely on other people with other skill set that would provide additional resources in order for this to actually be implemented successfully. Keeping that in mind, we need to know who the other manpower is or are, because it's more than one, right? So let's have a look at those. I look at this both in the context of the people within the team, the people within the organization, and the people outside of the organization, right? So that's how I look at this. Your colleagues, whether they're on the same team or on a different team, internal and external. So let's start looking at who those people are. You, the DBA or the sysadmin, because sometimes the sysadmin gets voluntold, so now he's taking care of the databases, yet he does not have any background at all with managing databases, but because he was sitting too close to the database server, he got voluntold, right? So first and foremost, the person responsible for taking care of the databases, whether you're officially the DBA with the DBA title or just acting as one unofficially because nobody else knows how this thing works, right? You have your responsibilities. You're taking care of your role plays a major important part in the HA and DR solution. For instance, let's just talk about databases here. Backups. You're the one who needs to restore from backups if the databases need to be restored from backups. If corruption happens, you're the one responsible for making sure that you can restore from backup or fix the corruption issue. You don't really need to restore from backups to fix corruption issues, but that's you. That falls on your plate. So you gotta get yourself ready, going back to the other storage, right? Coming up with documentation, having the proper operational run book for situations like corrupted page. How do we deal with it? Or an entire corrupted database. How do we deal with it? You got to make sure that you know what to do, because that's going to be you, right? That is going to be you, fortunately or unfortunately, as part of the job, right? Who else? The sysadmin, the one in charge of the servers. Now, in smaller organizations where the sysadmin and the DBA happens to be the same person, or if it's a team, they happen to be in the same team, it's okay, right? Because now there's no back and forth between the sysadmin and the DBA, and there's no gap between the communications. Of course, there will always be gaps in communications because one team member did not inform the other team member of what's going on. But in large organizations where you have silos, where the sysadmins are taking care of the servers, or in even larger organizations where the hardware team is responsible for racking and stacking servers in the data center, and then the sysadmin will be taking care of the operating system. And then if they decide, hey, we want to build a VM instead of physical machines, the VM admins will now be responsible for installing, managing, taking care of VMware or Hyper-V or any of the available virtualization platform. All of these things, again, just by enumerating that, you now have three teams: hardware, virtualization team, and the sysadmins. So it becomes even more complicated when you are communicating between those teams, especially when you're implementing a high availability and disaster recovery solution. One of the most common issue, and I want to call it this an issue or a challenge, one of the most common challenges that I see when implementing something like an availability group, I'll just use that as an example. An availability group is the coordination between different teams. So I'll break it down into DBA team, sysadmin team, VM admin team, and hardware team, right? 4 teams. It's coordination. Not only the coordination between the teams, but the expectation of what the responsibilities are. For instance, if the DBA only has access to the SQL Server instance, but not the underlying operating system, meaning they might be a sysadmin on the SQL Server instance, but not a local admin on the box or on the VM, if that's the VM, they would have to coordinate with the sysadmin in order to get stuff done. For example, building the cluster. If your AG requires, of course, for HA, you need that. Okay, this is not the read scale availability groups where you don't need failover clustering. Anyway, the SQL Server DBA would need to coordinate with the Windows sysadmins in order to build the cluster. So now it's the Windows sysadmins building the failover cluster before the DBAs could even create the AG. Not only that, if the Windows sysadmins or if Windows is sitting on a VM, now the Windows sysadmins need to coordinate with the VM admins to get the VMs provisioned. Now we're talking about 3 teams: the DBA team, the sysadmin team, the Windows/sysadmin team, and the VM team. Oh, and by the way, we need a new VM host because we're now spreading the replicas across multiple VMware hosts. Now we bring in the hardware admin to spin up a new VM host so that you can spread your replicas across multiple VM hosts. And see how this thing becomes complicated. And then it factors into the amount of time it takes for you to build something. In fact, if you are admin on all single aspects, hardware, VM, OS, and SQL Server, you can actually build an AD from scratch in less than 4 hours. But again, in large organizations where there's segregation of duties and silos, it becomes even more challenging. Now, I want to take it a step further. Because the DBA does not have Windows permissions, and because they do not have access to other resources outside of the failover cluster, like Active Directory, DNS, and networking, building the AG would require asking the sysadmins some permissions, like creating the cluster name object, or in this case, the available group listener name, or in the context of Active Directory, the virtual computer object. The DBA now needs to ask the Windows sysadmins permissions in order to create the listener name, because that's something external to SQL Server, right? And again, we're just talking about building and implementing the solution. What about operation and troubleshooting? One of the cases that I worked on a couple of years ago was a junior engineer responsible for Active Directory accidentally deleted the virtual computer object associated with the listener name. He thought, I don't know what this is, I don't see it in documentation, delete it. I don't know if that's exactly what he was thinking. But he accidentally, of course, and I say accidental because nobody intentionally does something harmful. The AG was still up and running, no big deal. 3 weeks later, when they needed to do maintenance, then they needed to fail over, the AG would not fail over. Why? Because the listener is a virtual computer object in Active Directory, and the virtual computer object was deleted. So now there's nothing to authenticate because the computer name is no longer there. Couldn't fail over. Took them a while. They were looking at recovering the listener name. I came in and I just decoupled the listener name from the AG, meaning I just deleted the listener name and then created a DNS alias that would point to the primary replica and brought the entire AG online. But this is one of those things where there's a disconnect between what the sysadmins are doing versus what the DBAs are doing that eventually impacts high availability. In that specific case, the Active Directory admin was not aware that this virtual computer object is a high availability object. He wasn't aware, right? In the same way, when the Windows sysadmins need to patch the underlying operating system, all they know, it's running on a cluster. And the way they dealt with clusters in the past was install the patch, reboot, install the patch, reboot, and let the cluster fail over. There's a proper way of doing that. And you don't just move resource groups or roles between nodes just because. You gotta get the proper change management process in place so that the DBAs can get involved. Or if you don't want them to get involved, there's a proper process that needs to be done in order for you to do proper maintenance, proper failover without causing the databases to go offline because they're not failover ready. Okay? I spent a lot of time on a sysadmin because that's, again, in large organizations, you would have to deal with sysadmins both on the Windows side, on the Active Directory side, or even on the VM side, asking for provisioning of VMs and making sure that the VMs running your available group replicas do not end up in a single physical host, because it defeats the purpose of single point of failure. The network admin, the one in charge of the network. Like I said, as the organization grows, more and more people will get involved. The network admin will be the one responsible for assigning IP addresses for the listener name or giving you the appropriate IP address for the listener name. They're the ones responsible for rolling out firewall rules for blocking specific traffic to specific port numbers. What if, and again, taking a lot of these stories from cases I've worked on, what if they roll out a firewall rule that blocks data replication traffic between available group replicas? It happened. Yeah, we took them a while to figure it out, not realizing that the network admins rolled out a firewall rule as part of their security policy mandate and forgot to inform the DBAs, hence blocking port 5022, which prevented AG replication traffic across the replicas. Yeah, the databases were not synchronized. And that, when something happened, of course, your transactional log records keep piling. Next thing you know, the database gets disconnected, and now you can no longer fail over, and now you're potentially looking at a large amount of data loss. Okay, they're the ones taking care of that, so make sure that you loop them in whenever you're building a high availability solution, high availability and or disaster recovery solution. The supplier. Now, I did mention here the hardware vendor, but that could be any supplier, right? That could be any supplier. That could be, and again, I'll just use hardware for instance. If, let's say, you are running everything on a SAN, and all of a sudden one of the drives on the SAN started malfunctioning, although you do have RAID configured, hopefully you do, how fast can your supplier issue a replacement if you place a purchase order? How quickly can they do that? Because that will factor into your recovery time objective in case something goes wrong. Not only that, are they close enough so that when you do request or submit a purchase order, they can send you a replacement part as quickly as they possibly can? One of my clients one of my clients decided to have Dell servers within their HA stack. So they built VMware HA, and then they put the SQL Server VMs in there, and they specifically chose Dell. I got bad experiences with Dell. I always go HP as much as possible, or Fujitsu, but they're very expensive. In fact, when I was working for Fujitsu, we do not recommend Fujitsu because they're very expensive, but they're reliable. The reason why they went with Dell was because they're very close to their distribution channels, their logistic distribution channels. So it's quick and fast. They have a service level agreement that when they order either a network adapter, a local disk, anything Dell related, they just pick up the phone, place a purchase order, and it will be within their office, delivered in their office within 24 hours. And that's okay. So they'll keep a spare of whatever part that they need for HA and just plug it in, then replacement, they'll call, 24 hours, they have that. It becomes challenging, especially when you do encounter issues with hardware that you need to replace. And it will take more than 48 hours or however long it takes to replace that specific part. Another thing here is your telco, your telecommunication company. If you're building a DR solution where you're spanning across different data centers, you are dependent on the telco. What is their SLA? Because if their SLA does not match your SLA, you're screwed. I'm just saying. This is something that I talked about with my customer when they decide they want to move to the cloud, Azure, AWS, GCP, is to read what the SLA is as far as when implementing their solution. That could be cloud VMs. What's the SLA? Because if the cloud provider's SLA does not meet your SLA, you're putting yourself at risk. I remember this was a couple of years ago when we had a massive AWS outage, and all they would tell you is, oh, you're going to get credits off of your bill next month. That's not what I want to hear, because if I would design an HA/DR solution across multiple availability zones or multiple regions, I want to make sure that if something goes wrong, I can still meet my SLA, my RPO, and RTO. Okay, your cloud providers, if you are deploying to a public cloud infrastructure, needs to meet your SLAs. So you got to read the fine print, right? Even with colocation facilities, if you're deploying your own hardware to colocation facilities, they need to be able to meet your SLA. It's frustrating when you know for a fact that, hey, my server is not responding, KVM doesn't work, and now I needed somebody to push a button, pick up the phone, and nobody's picking up the phone when they're supposed to be there to power cycle push a button so that it power cycles the server. It's frustrating. What if server's not responding and all of a sudden you have an outage? They need to be there. Or you need to get yourself ready, hop on a car, go to the data center. Okay? Your supplier is more than just a hardware vendor. It's your quote unquote vendor, whoever that vendor is. And this is something that I tell my customers. When you're picking a supplier, most of the time it's all about cost. Cost is just one factor. Of course, if you ask the chief financial officer, they only care about cost. They want to reduce costs as much as possible. I look at other things like culture, company culture of the vendor. What does that have to do with HA and DR? I remember the time when, I think this was Extreme IO, that got bought over by another storage vendor. And the first thing that I look at is company culture. Why is that? Remember, you're still going to pick up the phone and talk to people from the supplier. If a company that was really good with customer service got acquired by a bigger company, again, mergers and acquisitions, and they're uncertain of what is about to happen with their job, are they going to be excited to help you when there comes an issue? Probably not. And that's why whenever something like a merger and acquisition, like for instance, I think it was VMware that got acquired by another company, and I immediately called a couple of my friends at VMware and asked them, so how is the company going? Why? Because again, people don't think about this. If I have my AGs running on VMs in a VMware infrastructure, my VMware infrastructure goes down, I pick up the phone. If the other person on the line is scared as hell about losing his job, do you think he will be capable enough to assist? Probably not. He's more concerned about keeping his job. If there's a rumor of layoffs, the tech support guy on the other end of the phone is not going to be very helpful when he's scared about losing his job. That's why, again, people don't think about this. I look at it more from what am I going to expect as far as SLA is concerned when I pick up the phone and call my supplier or my vendor. Okay? What else? Your boss. The one in charge of making decisions, right? Your boss. The one in charge of making the tough calls. Why is that? There's only so much we could do, and one of the things why tech people do not want to rise up to leadership positions is because we are more comfortable doing the tech stuff, deploying servers, fixing issues, troubleshooting issues, solving problems. We're more comfortable with doing that. But then making decisions, making the tough calls is something that we're not comfortable with. I worked on a project more than, almost 2 decades now. Yeah, almost 17 years. Worked on a project a couple of years ago, and we were just there on standby. Hardware vendors, the SAN vendor came in, they would replace the SAN for a failover clustered instance, and we had an 8-hour maintenance window. 4 hours later, they replaced the hardware, reconfigure the SAN. 6 hours into the maintenance window, they couldn't bring up the SQL Server instance. It's just a hardware replacement, right? Replace the SAN, replicate the data, synchronize everything, and that's it. They couldn't. And they were spending more and more time trying to fix the problem. The CIO walked in and asked the question, how long is this going to take? You know, the dreaded looking behind your shoulder and asking the question, when is this coming back online? And they kept saying, the hardware vendor kept saying, oh, it's only a few more minutes, only a few more minutes. 7 hours in, the CIO said, let's roll back. Forget about what you're doing. Let's roll back. It took the CIO to make that call because, again, we engineers would like to move ahead and try to solve the problem as much as we possibly can. But keep in mind, we have SLAs. We were given 8 hours as a maintenance window to replace, not us, but the vendor, to replace the hardware. But when it's not happening, we need to roll it back because we need to, to spin up the entire failover clustered instance within that maintenance window. Meaning by the time the maintenance window is done, it needs to be up and running, right? The CIO needed to step up, make the tough call, even though not us, the vendor. The vendor has already spent, I don't want to say wasted, all that time, effort, and resource, and the anxiety and the frustration of trying to replace the SAN. The CIO had to step in, make the tough call, roll everything back in order for us to meet the maintenance window. And then we rescheduled the weekend after. The thing is, you need to have somebody willing to make the tough calls if that's not you. So you have to coordinate with your boss. You have to coordinate with whoever is in charge of making the tough calls, because tough calls needed to be made, especially in case of emergency. Okay, tough calls need to be made. Who else? Your service provider. I kind of glossed over this in when I talked about the supplier. Okay, because like I said, HA and DR solutions, HA and DR is a team sport, which means you would have to rely on your supplier for your hardware, your service provider, again, co-location facility, public cloud provider, or even a third-party vendor for your backups. Like for instance, if you're using a Veeam with VMware, now you're dependent on VMware and or Veeam for your backup solution. How is their SLA? What's your SLA agreement with those vendors? I've been in a lot of war room, they call them war room conversations, where everybody is on a conference room or joining via a conference call, and people are pointing fingers. Like Microsoft was saying, it's not our problem, it's the SAN's problem. The SAN vendor would say, no, it's not our problem, it's VMware's problem. And VMware would say, no, it's not a problem, it's a hardware problem. And all of these things with pointing fingers, if they cannot resolve that, your SLA and your RTO, your recovery time objective, will still be counting. So you need to coordinate that. You need to make sure that, again, your supplier will be able, or the service provider rather, will be able to provide the services within your required SLA. Okay, again, the last thing you want is to have this expectation that your service provider will be responding to you within the given SLA requirement that you have. A client of mine 3 years ago, they were the service provider, meaning they were the telco, the telecommunications company. And mandated by law, they needed to work with their competitor. They're providing co-location facilities, they have their data center, and so they're providing co-location services to their customers. But because it is mandated by law, they needed to work with their competitor to build redundant network connectivity. Part of their DR strategy is to replicate everything from their production data center to the DR data center. One weekend, they noticed that their MPLS started giving them like weird data, when you have like your monitoring stuff going on. And they also noticed that the data replication happening between data centers slowed down. Remember, they have two network connectivity. One is theirs, and the other is their competitors. The way they did it was they're utilizing both, so it's 100%. What they didn't know was that their competitor, the other telecommunication network service provider, performed maintenance on that link, so now the throughput dropped 50%. Yeah, that's why it took a while. And they couldn't do anything about it because the network service provider did not inform them about this. So now they were scrambling to figure out what they needed to do to make sure that they still meet their recovery time objectives and SLAs for DR. The good thing is it's DR. The DR, RPO, RTO, and SLA isn't as stringent as HA's RPO, RTO, and SLA. But the thing is, it's frustrating knowing that you're depending on a service provider to do what they're supposed to do, help you achieve your HA and DR goals, yet they're also the ones causing all the problems. And again, I could count so many cases, like another co-location facility where they implemented a combination of both VMware and Veeam updates that caused the databases to get corrupted. It's this specific combination of VMware and Veeam updates that caused the databases to get corrupted. So every time they're taking Veeam snapshots, it corrupted the databases. That now they had to sue the co-location facility because they're the ones doing all the patching. They had to sue the service provider, or in this case, the co-location facility, because it caused that problem. And we had to work for like a couple of days to recover the data from the corruption. But this is, again, this is how important it is to make sure that you have a solid relationship, not just relationship, but knowing what your expectations are as far as service level agreements are concerned with your service providers. Okay, so the other manpower, or M, which stands for manpower, DBA, person in charge of the database, sysadmin, person in charge of the servers, or not. I'm not just referring to a person, but an entire team, right? Network admin team, your supplier, your boss, and your service provider. These are the people, the manpower that you need to work with whenever you're building, implementing, designing, and even administering, managing, troubleshooting, operating an HADR solution, right? This is part 2. I broke it down into 3 parts because there's so much to cover. We talked about S, which is that other storage. This time we talked about, and let me pop the slide back there again so you could take note. That other storage is the S. Here, M stands for manpower. The other manpower outside of you or your team, okay, that needs to be included in the conversation, setting the expectations for recovery point, recovery time, objectives, and service level agreements, and what they promised. What did they promise? What are we expecting from them? Okay, and this is, I don't want to say comprehensive list of all the manpower that you need to include as part of your team, overall team. And I did mention in the beginning, internal and external. So the supplier and the service provider are external to your organization, which you have no control over, right? Within the company, you can implement policies that, hey, you need to meet these objectives and SLA requirements. But for a third party, somebody's who's outside of your organization, we don't have any control over, right? That is about it for part 2. Tune in for part 3 of this Back to Basics series on SMH, the who and the what of HADR. And if you need any help, whether it's doing an assessment of an existing HA solution, looking at some gaps within the infrastructure, or maybe you need your team ramped up, be trained, be ready to take over managing and administering your existing HA and DR solution, reach out. Use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy session. Let's have that conversation. I call them discovery and strategy sessions because we're going to explore what the overall goal is so that we can come up with a step-by-step strategy on how to achieve those goals. Maybe it's providing high availability for your mission-critical databases. Maybe it's, again, doing an assessment to fill in the gaps. But whatever those goals are, we are going to come up with a strategy that is unique to you that would help you achieve those goals. And if I can help, I'm more than happy to do that. If not, I will steer you in the direction that would help serve you best. Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. This would lead you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. Again, looking forward to having that conversation with you using that link. All right, that is about it for part 2. Tune in for part 3. Right, part 3. Again, I broke it down into 3 parts. S, that other storage, M, that the other manpower, and H, I might want to start thinking about what would that H be. Tune in again for the next episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show, where we're going to be doing part 3 of this Back to Basics series. Enjoy the rest of your week.